What's up, folks? Valorant here. Dragonflight is coming soon, so I wanted to talk a bit about my thoughts on the Frost Mage talent tree, this time specifically from a raid perspective. First of all, the opinions expressed in this video are my own. Second, if you recently watched my video on Mythic Plus talents, there is a little bit of overlapping content, but I promise I've re-recorded every single section specifically for raid builds. Of course, we are still in beta, so any of this can change before or even after Dragonflight releases. If there's any major changes from here on out, I'll either update this video, or depending on the changes, I'll just take it down. Finally, I do still plan on releasing a patch 10.0 Frost Mage raid guide, but my idea for that guide is to be a little more beginner friendly, if you will. And so in the guide, I'm probably not going to go very in depth regarding talent selection. Maybe just give my recommended starter build, for players to just jump right in. So I wanted to do this video as sort of a companion to that goes a little more in depth on how I think individual talents feel and talk about some of the choices you have with your build. So the way I attempted to capture this was by giving each individual talent my own personal rating of green, yellow, orange, or red. Essentially, green is a mandatory talent. You always pick this talent. Yellow is not mandatory, but still pretty decent, so this is where some of your personal choice might come in. Orange talents aren't completely useless, but for whatever reason, they aren't very good. And of course, red talents are the ones you should never spend a point on whatsoever. Last but not least, keep in mind that again, I'm analyzing each of these talents from a purely rating perspective. You may see some talents in here that are orange, and they're great in a dungeon build. That's not what this video is about. So, getting right into it, I will begin with the class tree, but I'm not going to tackle everything in the whole class tree. The class tree is largely your choice of utility spells. There's definitely some mandatory talents in here, but for the most part, they're all right down the middle, and you'll pick them up pretty quick. In the Mage class tree, you'll never be down to your last couple of points trying to choose between two really good talents. It just won't happen because there aren't that many good talents. If anything, you'll be struggling to choose from the least mediocre talents just to work your way down past the gates. The first three here, Ice Block, Overflowing Energy, and Invis, I would consider all of these mandatory. Invis is a little less mandatory since you'll be taking greater Invis, but you still have to get down to Alter Time, so it's effectively mandatory. Now, the whole next row here is entirely situational. There are very few raid bosses ever where Remove Curse or Spell Steal come into play. Incantation could situationally be useful for dealing with mechanics, but I think your safe bet here is just going with some combination of Tempest Barrier, Arcane Warding, and Winter's Protection. As you might expect, Mirror Images, one of the best defensive cooldowns in the entire game. Rune of Power, of course, and Alter Time are absolutely mandatory. If you're not a fan of Rune of Power, I'm sorry, but it is still better than Incanter's Flow. Not so much better like it was in Shadowlands, but it is still better. On the next tier, you definitely want Master of Time, and you probably want Cryo Freeze as well. Quick-Witted might be situationally useful on fights that require like a tight interrupt rotation, sort of like Kel'Thuzad in patch 9.1, but it's pretty much your only viable path down to Shimmer, so that's kind of an easy choice. Reduplication and reabsorption are essentially completely useless in Raid, and if I had to spend any other points here, I'd say maybe Diverted Energy, but the rest is terrible for raiding. Next up, either Shimmer or Ice Flows is mandatory, of course, depending on your choice. On ad fights, you might pick up Ice Nova for AoE, but both Ice Nova and Ring of Frost, and honestly, even Blast Wave are situationally useful at best. You definitely want the two secondary stat nodes, Tome of Ronin, Tome of Antonidas, but Improved Frost Nova, Rigid Ice, and Energized Barriers are all pretty bad. Past the final gate here, you definitely want Flow of Time, Greater Invis, and Temporal Warp. In dungeons, I do play Time Anomaly, but in raids, you will pretty often get 3 Bloodlusts per fight with Temporal Warp, especially when you're first progging on bosses and you don't have them on farm yet. So it's kind of a no-brainer there, in my opinion. I'm going to skip ahead to the bottom corners here, because the rest of your choice in this tree pretty much depends whether you go Meteor or Shifting Power. And when it comes to single target damage, Meteor is honestly the slightly better option here, but not by much. Depending on the fight, you might want Shifting Power for some cooldown reduction in order to maybe line up cooldowns with phases of the fight. But otherwise, Meteor does get a slight edge here. And unlike Shifting Power, it is an instant cast ability. And so, of course, that does give you Dragon's Breath. You don't need as many AoE control abilities in Raid, like Blast Wave, Dragon's Breath, etc. But I do feel in this situation, it's a little bit better than Blast Wave. Jumping into the Spec Tree here, the first gate here is pretty easy, because pretty much everything is mandatory, except maybe Everlasting Frost and Frostbite. Frostbite here is a good example of a talent that's great in dungeons, but effectively completely useless in Raid. And Piercing Cold here is exactly the opposite. So you'll see we pretty much take Piercing Cold straight down through Bone Chilling, Flash Freeze, and Splintering Cold on the way down to Splitting Ice. And even on purely single target fights like Taros, for example, the 5% bonus damage to icicles makes this worth taking, even if there's no cleave going on. And then Hailstones down here is probably one of the best talents in the entire tree. And this is the talent that makes Mastery such a good stat for us in Dragonflight. Unfortunately, unless Glacial Spike gets a significant buff, at this time it's not tuned well enough to be viable. At some point during the beta, they did make Glacial Spike crits take 6 seconds of give 6 seconds of icy propulsion, which was nice, but it's still not enough to compete with Freezing Wind's build, essentially. Coming down the middle of the tree, we've got Lonely Winter and Ice Collar, which is essentially the old improved Blizzard. Now, Ice Collar is outstanding for funnel damage if there's enough adds. But unless there's enough adds to funnel, this is not a must-have talent. So down through Lonely Winter and into Wintertide and Icy Veins. So all of this central fork here at the bottom is absolutely mandatory for raiding. So I'm not going to dive too deep on any of this. It's the same stuff we've been playing with for pretty much all of Shadowlands by now. And as we start to explore the left side of the tree, Perpetual Winter is, of course, outstanding. It's one of the biggest changes to Frost Mage in this entire expansion. Frozen Touch is pretty good as well. It's always been pretty good. We just couldn't take it simultaneously with Chain Reaction, but now we can. Glacial Assault over here, unfortunately, is just pretty bad. It's obvious they tried to keep our Shadowlands tier set bonus around in some form, but it's just very lackluster, especially for a 2-point talent. Deep Shatter is actually quite good for single target. However, when we get into looking at full builds with the amount of talent points we have available, you'll probably find these being kind of the last 2 points that you spend. You'll notice that I gave Comet Storm a red rating here, but hear me out. It's not that Comet Storm is bad. In fact, it's pretty good. Even if we don't have a Comet Storm based tier set bonus anymore, the problem is its position in the tree. Comet Storm is good, but you're pretty much out of points by now. If we had more points to spend, it wouldn't be a problem, but we don't, because there's too much other absolutely mandatory stuff to take that runs out your points before you can reach over here to Comet Storm. So, Comet Storm is good, it's just out of reach. Freezing Rain definitely has potential on heavy ad fights, but only if you also take Ice Collar for improved funnel damage. I'm not going to get into Cold Front and Fractured Frost. It's just not viable for a raid build. It was only ever a Mythic Plus build and never really viable in Raid, even in Shadowlands. If you want a little more discussion on why it's no longer viable for dungeon builds, you can watch my last video on Mythic Plus talent builds. As I said, I am going to be working on a 10.0 raid guide that has my recommended starter build. But if I had to put all this together into kind of a one-size-fits-all build for raiding, what would it look like? Well, it would probably be something like this. I think the only situational changes I would make to this build would be possibly switching these 2 points from Deep Shatter into maybe Freezing Rain and Ice Collar on very ad-heavy fights. But the jury is kind of still out on how many ads it would take for that build to be better. I've done a little bit of preliminary sim testing on, thresholds for casting Blizzard and things like that, and kind of the preliminary results I'm getting is that on 3 targets, it's more optimal to cast Blizzard if you have Ice Collar and Freezing Rain. But usually on a raid boss, there's not always 3 ads active the entire fight. It ebbs and flows with the amount of ads available. So that's something we're going to have to wait and see. So I'm sure that the question on everyone's mind is, how exactly is Frost performing on beta? And honestly, I've done a couple of raid bosses on the beta, and Frost is okay. I don't think it's going to be meta or raiding by any means. I don't think you're going to see much representation from Frost Mage in the Race to World First. You might see it played on maybe 1 or 2 bosses that have lots of ads to funnel off of, but by no means is Frost bad for raiding. In fact, most of the problems we experienced at Shadowlands have actually been smoothed out by things like the flurry change, 2 flurry charges, having access to Frozen Touch, and Icy Propulsion working when Icy Veins is not active. If you'd like to talk more about anything in this video, or if you disagree with me, you can find a link to my Discord server down below, or you can just drop a comment here on the video. I am hoping to get back on Twitch and stream Dragonflight keys over at twitch.tv/Valorant, but I will be prioritizing my YouTube channel. Up next, I will be working on my 10.0 Mythic Plus and Raid guides for Frostmage. So keep an eye out for that. Until then, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.